Hello, my name's Molly, and today we're going to be talking about the Monro-Kellie Doctrine, which is how intracranial pressure is affected in the brain. So first we're going to talk about the three players. Firstly, we have mean arterial pressure, also known as blood pressure. This is the systolic over diastolic blood pressure that's flowing through your body at any time, and we can measure this. Secondly, we have intracranial pressure, which is a separate type of pressure, and it's not just affected by blood. It's referred to as the pressure in your brain, and we'll talk about what affects this shortly. Finally, we have cerebral perfusion pressure, also known as CPP. So cerebral refers to the brain, and perfusion pressure relates to the amount of blood that is able to access tissue at any given time. This is really important so that tissue can get sufficient oxygen and nutrients to function. In the brain, this is especially important because the brain controls all of our higher functions, movements, and regulates our cardiovascular and respiratory activity. So I'll give you a moment just to process all of that information and let me know if you have any questions. So the key equation related to the Monro-Kellie doctrine is that cerebral perfusion pressure is equal to mean arterial pressure minus intracranial pressure. And you can see that I've written that down for you there. So as I mentioned, we're now going to talk about what affects intracranial pressure, which is really the most variable thing in the Monro-Kellie doctrine. It can change at any time. So the first thing that affects intracranial pressure is blood. Secondly is cerebrospinal fluid. So cerebrospinal fluid is made in the choroid plexus of the brain and is secreted through the lateral ventricles and cerebral aqueduct and into the spinal cord. Thirdly is the cranium, also known as the skull. So these are three components of intracranial pressure, and as you can see, two of these are fluid and one is solid. So those fluid components, blood and cerebrospinal fluid, their volume can change according to the intracranial pressure in the brain and whether one of these things is more abundant than the other. On the other hand, the volume of the cranium cannot change. If you touch your own head for a moment, you'll feel that it's pretty solid, so there's no way that it can change its volume. And that makes sense, right? Our skull's very hard and durable so that it can withstand force, so we wouldn't want it to change its shape or its volume. But we do need our blood and our cerebral spinal fluid to be able to adjust their volumes depending on what else is going on in our bodies. So there are a few key scenarios which occur on a common basis in the human body which can change our intracranial pressure and therefore how much blood is able to access our tissues. And that's the really important question that we're asking ourselves today. How much blood can access my tissues, and is this going to have an impact on my overall health? And for most of these scenarios, the answer is yes. So the first thing that can change our cerebral perfusion pressure is what's called a subdural hematoma. So that's like a bruise in the brain, and you've probably heard of this. The second is a stroke, also known as a cerebrovascular accident. Thirdly is severe blood loss, and this doesn't just have to be from a wound to the head. It can be from anywhere in the body because the loss of blood puts us into a state that's known as hypovolemic shock. And the fourth factor that affects intracranial pressure is systemic hypertension. So that means overall high blood pressure. Given that around the world we're becoming increasingly obese, systemic hypertension is a very serious problem. The two scenarios that I want to talk about today, though, are a subdural hematoma and a stroke. We're going to talk about these because they're relatively easy to understand, and then we'll talk about severe blood loss and systemic hypertension at a later time. So as I mentioned, a subdural hematoma is like a big bruise on the brain, and it's between the the dura mater and the arachnoid matter in the brain. So it starts off as blood and then it will become old blood as the lesion continues to form. So it's called a mass lesion. And you may have heard of the mass lesion effect, which is where when there's a mass in the brain, brain tissue gets pushed from side to side, and that's what you can see on this scan here. It's called midline shift. You can see that the lateral ventricles have been pushed over the midline, and I've just circled the subdural hematoma for you on the scan there. You can see that it looks a little bit like a samurai sword, and we say samurai sword starts with S, and so does subdural hematoma. So let's talk about the Monro-Kellie doctrine and how this is affected by a subdural hematoma. So as I mentioned, a mass lesion is processed neither as blood nor as cerebrospinal fluid. But hang on a minute, I just said that the three key players in intracranial pressure were blood, cerebrospinal fluid, and the skull. So how does that work if our body is recognising this lesion as neither blood nor CSF? Well, unfortunately, this means that our body is not very good at reducing its intracranial pressure when we have a subdural hematoma. In other words, there are pretty poor compensation mechanisms. If you think about the Monro-Kellie doctrine, blood or CSF should be able to decrease to compensate, but for whatever reason, this mass lesion effect means that blood and cerebrospinal fluid remain the same. So the pressure in the skull, the intracranial pressure, will increase a lot with nothing to bring it back down. So this means that pressure is increasing in the skull, and therefore there can be less blood to access the tissue because there is so much compression. As a result, you'll see I've written down our key equation again. Cerebral perfusion pressure equals mean arterial pressure minus intracranial pressure. If we have no change in mean arterial pressure and a large increase in intracranial pressure, think about what this means for the subtraction. If you're taking a number that doesn't change and subtracting a greater number from that, the total will be smaller. Therefore, cerebral perfusion pressure will decrease, and this means that less blood is able to access the tissues, which is why we often get tissue death in instances of subdural hematoma. If the pressure in the skull increases enough, unfortunately this condition can be fatal, so it's important to treat it very quickly. But today we're just going to be thinking about it from from the point of view of assessing patterns. As you can see there, I'm just summarising the fact that tissue is very easily damaged in the instance of a subdural hematoma, so you can get some pretty serious long-term complications. So that's the first scenario. We're now going to be talking about the instance of a stroke, also known as a cerebrovascular accident. And as you can see, there are two types of stroke. There's what's called an ischemic stroke and what's called a hemorrhagic stroke. So a hemorrhagic stroke is when there is bleeding in the skull caused by the rupture of a blood vessel, be it an artery or a vein. We're going to go through some causes of hemorrhagic stroke. And the most obvious one is high blood pressure. When you have high blood pressure, what can happen is that blood flow in the endothelium, the innermost layer of the blood vessel, becomes turbulent. So this means that it disrupts the laminar flow that is so important in the human body. When you have turbulent blood flow, the endothelium becomes damaged and is more susceptible to rupturing, which is exactly what happens in a hemorrhagic stroke caused by hypertension. The vessel in the brain ruptures, causing a leakage of a massive amount of blood into the brain. So I'll just give you a minute to process all of that and to think about what the effect on the Monro-Kellie doctrine might be when you have an increase in the amount of blood in the skull. Now have a look at the scan. You can see that I'm circling the area of hemorrhage, and we'll talk about imaging at another time. But it's a darkened area, and that entire area is the blood in the subarachnoid space, which is the middle space in the brain. So you've got the dura mater most superficially, then the subarachnoid space, and then you've got the pia mater. Okay. So we're now going to talk about the effect of a hemorrhagic stroke on the Monro-Kellie doctrine. So, when you have a large amount of bleeding, you're going to have an increase in the amount of blood in the subarachnoid space, as I already mentioned. So take a moment and think about what this is going to do to the pressure inside the brain. Think about blowing up a balloon. If you're blowing up a balloon with more and more air, the pressure in that balloon is going to increase until the balloon will eventually pop. Now, obviously, your skull is not going to pop, but it's the same principle. Now, unfortunately, blood also has a mass effect similar to the subdural hematoma. So this mass effect is going to increase intracranial pressure. Now, if you have an increase in that intracranial pressure, and you look back at our original equation where CPP equals MAP minus ICP, if ICP is increasing, MAP is also going to try and increase so that that subtraction does not have as much of an effect. So MAP is increasing, our blood pressure is going up. Now, if you think about this logically, it's going to make the problem even worse. Because if you have more blood flowing into the brain, you're going to increase the intracranial pressure even more. And unfortunately, that's just going to lead to even worse cerebral perfusion pressure. So less blood is accessing the tissue in the brain and providing it with oxygen and nutrients, which means that the long-term effects of a hemorrhagic stroke can be devastating because certain centres of the brain can be compromised by that tissue death. For example, a lot of people who have strokes, you may notice that they never return to normal motor function or they lose their ability to talk. So now we're going to think about those components of intracranial pressure again. Blood, cerebrospinal fluid, and the skull. Now remember, the skull cannot change its volume or its shape. It's set in stone. We have an increase in the amount of blood in the skull because mean arterial pressure is increasing. So what's going to happen to the cerebrospinal fluid? Now, if you're thinking that it will decrease, you're right. But cerebrospinal fluid cannot just disappear. So instead it's going to shift. And it's going to shift down into the spinal cord. But this decrease in the volume of cerebrospinal fluid can only happen to a certain extent because it's still imperative that we have some in the brain. So unfortunately, there comes a point of no return where the mean arterial pressure has increased to such an extent that we can no longer compensate in this way. So now we're going to talk about an ischemic stroke. So an ischemic stroke. Ischemia directly means tissue death caused by a clot. So you may have heard of ischemic heart disease before. So let's go through some causes of an ischemic stroke. So similar to ischemia in the context of heart disease, where a heart attack can be caused by a blood clot, an ischemic stroke is also most commonly caused by a blood clot. And it's called a thrombus. And this thrombus often forms somewhere else in the carotid artery in the neck. The thrombus breaks off and travels up to those tiny vessels in the brain and occludes blood flow to the brain, causing tissue death. And as you can see, I've also written atherosclerosis down as a key cause because the disruption of the endothelium by increases in turbulent blood flow, increases in cholesterol, will make the endothelium more susceptible to forming blood clots. And at another time, we can go through exactly how this calcification or formation of blood clots and thrombi can actually occur. But today I just want to focus on this Monro-Kellie doctrine, which really is a physiological pattern observation exercise. So, Monro-Kellie doctrine, ischemic stroke. So we have a blood clot, which is blocking blood from accessing the brain. And it also impedes venous outflow from the brain. So blood can't get in, blood can't get out. So intracranial pressure is increasing because we have edema in the brain, swelling of tissue. And as you can see, I've written that tissue starts dying. And that makes sense, right? Because you've got a buildup of carbon dioxide because blood can't get out of the brain. And you've also got a lack of oxygen and nutrients. So this starts to happen pretty quickly. And that's why you talk about the 4-hour window when someone is having a stroke. So, compensation mechanisms. ICP is increasing, same as before. MAP is going to start increasing. Now, as you can see, I'm also writing down that you have obstructed venous outflow. It's important to remember this. Blood cannot get out of the brain as well because the vessels are starting to constrict as the brain tissue swells. So, as mean arterial pressure increases, intracranial pressure will increase. And unfortunately, the overall effect on cerebral perfusion pressure is that it will decrease. And that's why all these events are so serious. So I've just given you the answer there about what happens to CPP, but think about that. So that's us for today. If you have any questions, let me know, but that's the Monro-Kellie doctrine. If I could tell you anything that's important to remember, it's that it's all an exercise of pattern observation. And in any of these adverse events, the broad effect is going to be a decrease in cerebral perfusion pressure. Your job is to work out why. Thank you for your time.